Hey, this is Gerd Handel, and welcome to the Inner Light Project. This show is for anyone who's wanting to lead a happier, healthier, and enlightened life. Create more self-love, inject more joy and abundance into their daily life. Join me for inspiring interviews and spiritual topics so you can shine your inner light. Hello and welcome to the Inner Light Project. My name is Gerd Handel, and today I want to share with you someone who is helping people to heal their trauma, regulate their emotions, and heal their inner child, and have boundaries as an empath. Dr. Anna Kress is a licensed clinical psychologist with almost 20 years of experience providing psychotherapy. She's helped people who struggle with anxiety, depression, and trauma, and she believes we can all heal our past. Hi, Dr. Anna. I'm just grateful to have you on the show, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Oh, I am as well. We've been talking earlier, and I'm like, this is just going to be such a powerful interview.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about everything, related to empaths and all of the healing type of work that I do with clients. So excited.
Oh, bless you. And I want to start off originally at the beginning about like what your life was like before you became a psychologist.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, my sort of empath journey is what led me to become a psychologist. So I was one of those people who, you could probably describe as highly sensitive, HSP, who, even as a baby, sort of born kind of, with the sensitive nervous system, kind of like lights and sounds and things like that. Really, kind of more hard to soothe, I guess, more difficult in a sense,
Yeah.
I'm sure for my parents. And so I kind of, was born that way. And but then, at the age of 7, we moved to the inner city, and I lived there for many, many years. And so, I was very aware that I was sensitive and emotionally kind of just very aware of everyone's emotions around me and kind of picking those things up. But because I lived in the inner city, there was a lot of crime and things like that. I actually had to kind of hide that. That would not be smart for me to, to have that sort of wear my heart on my sleeve in that environment. So, as many empaths, I kind of had ways that I coped, which was, many empaths kind of like find ways to shut down, whether that's, addictions or kind of being tough or, different ways to shut it down. For me, it was a lot of being very aloof in the outside world, very like cold and distant and things like that. And then also, what I call what's called cognitive bypassing and spiritual bypassing. So cognitive bypassing, like as a teen, I just loved reading and, nonfiction books like psychology, spirituality, things like that. And I thought, well, if I understand feelings from a very intellectual perspective, then I'm feeling things, but it was very intellectual. And then spiritually bypassing, because I would meditate for like, an hour or two a day. I was really into meditation, which I continue to do now, but at a more reasonable pace, so that's how I coped with it. And, those were great for my nervous system to have that kind of break, to meditate a lot and exercise and do these, very healthy things. But, when you start shutting down that emotional sensitivity, you're really losing that richness that I think that sensitivity can give your life. And it's so empowering when you do take that back. So when I was somewhere in the 90s as a teenager, the first time I heard the word empath or read it actually, was in a book by Dr. Judith Orloff.
Oh yeah.
She's of course like written every book on empaths. And I love her books, and I've done a ton of trainings with her. She's amazing. And the book was called Second Sight, and it was about her journey as an intuitive and an empath. Although I think she calls it like psychic empath or something at that point in the book. So it's a little bit of a different perspective on it. But when I read that, I was like, oh my God, I feel so seen. And it was so validating. And I was like, wow, she's a psychiatrist at UCLA, and she's, really, bridging these two worlds of, being an intuitive, spiritual kind of empath person. and also being a psychiatrist, very traditionally trained. So
Mm.
I thought that's amazing. And that's what actually inspired me to become a therapist, a
Wow.
psychologist. And so, I've adapted
Wow.
her kind of trainings and work with empaths in my own work over the last like 20 years of being a therapist. So that's sort of how I got here. Of course, it's always a long journey of continued personal growth. So there are definitely, still areas where I'm like, okay, I'm still going to work on that, um, but that's kind of where it started.
Wow. I totally relate with what you're saying about how we have to kind of put up on the front as an empath. And I think that kind of comes from when we're really young, right? So
Mm,
we're told to kind of shut down our emotions, toughen up,
yes.
fit into society. And if we cry in front of others, we're seen as weak. And I think somewhere we quickly learn as empaths that we need to have a harder exterior, because if we show our true self, people are really going to hurt us.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting too because like in addition to like that shutdown that you're describing, I
Yeah.
think one of the other common responses too is, if someone's not shutting it down, is to try to save everyone.
Yeah.
To try to like, if I could take care of
Yeah.
everyone, if I could fix one, if I could regulate everyone's emotions and do all the emotional labor and heal everyone,
Mm.
then I will feel better. And then it's also, a way to self-protect, because if you're absorbing people's emotions and the people around you are experiencing a lot of negative emotions or
Mm.
difficult, painful emotions, then that's actually harder on you. So in some ways it's a benefit to try to make your environment a little bit better, but it really comes at a cost.
Yeah. I
That's where codependency can sort of happen.
I totally relate, because that was me growing up. I was the type of person that listened to everyone's problems, probably from the age of 8, funny enough.
Right.
Adults would come to me and they'd be like, "Oh, I feel better after speaking to you." And then I would absorb it. And then when I was studying journalism, this is my old personality, but I was working in a pharmacy, um, dispensing medicines
Right.
because I wanted to help people. So that was my way of helping people. However, when I would be giving them the medication, I laugh because the pharmacist would say, "What are you doing?" And I'd say, "Why?" Because the moment I would hand over the prescription or their medication, they would tell me their life story. And
Right.
they'd be like, the pharmacists are like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm not doing anything. I'm just stood here." But people seem to be telling me their
Right.
problems. And then they'll be like, "Oh, I feel better." And the same happened throughout my whole life. Like when I was at university, friends would call me up to like 3 a.m. in the morning. I felt like saving them. But the reality was for me was that, like you said, it was my escapism from actually facing my own pain, because there was a lot of pain in my
Right.
childhood that I wasn't ready to acknowledge. And it took till my mid-20s to actually wake up and realize, no, it's time for me to heal. And I feel a lot of empaths do that when we've grown up. Well, not all of us, but some who have grown up with a lot of trauma growing up as a child, or a family member has not been well. We tend to kind of brush our feelings under the carpet because we've been made from a
Right.
young age to believe that what we feel is irrelevant and the other person's emotions are more important than ours.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of empaths are sort of put in that caretaker role growing
Mm.
up. And like the causes of being an empath, it's sort of, if it comes down to like three causes typically. One is like temperament and genetics. So you can
Mm.
be sort of born as a baby very sensitive. The second one is trauma, like you're describing, being put in that caretaker role, whether it's because someone is ill, like physically or mentally, if there's abuse or neglect, and the third reason is there's a combination of both.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's because you're already sensitive and you notice that someone maybe isn't so healthy around you,
Yeah.
and it's easier to do what's like called a fawn trauma response. We have the four different stress responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And a lot
Mm.
of empaths tend towards that fawn trauma response. It's a trauma response when it's chronic. So where there's a lot of people pleasing, accommodating, caretaking, putting your own needs aside. And so often there is a combination of like that genetic kind of predisposition and also having that trauma history where
Mm.
you feel the need to care for others, because that's the way to stay safe
Yeah.
in that situation. That's the adaptive thing to do.
Yeah. 100%. And you just reminded me of something actually, with my own childhood. And I think a lot of empaths have this as well, where you get told as a young age to go hug that auntie or uncle, but you don't want to, but you get forced. So in that
Mhm.
moment, you're kind of ignoring your needs. But as an empath, and especially as a child empath, you've then absorbed that
Yes.
other person's emotion. So the reason why you didn't want to go near them was because you
Right.
didn't want their energy.
Yeah, yeah. And often too, like, we often talk about like empaths and narcissists,
Yeah.
and the relationship between the two, because, you know, narcissists are, often in those situations where there's like someone who's very authoritarian telling you what
Mm,
to do and literally taking your power away as a child rather than understanding and validating your feelings or having the empathy, you know.
mm.
And especially with someone who's sensitive, a sensitive child, you want to have a little extra empathy, if
Yeah.
anything, rather than being sort of authoritarian or sort of self-absorbed as a caregiver. So I think it's very tricky because, a lot of empaths did have narcissistic parents. Not always the
Mm,
case,
yeah.
but there was, that's often the case. And, the problem is that we're biologically driven to attach to our caregivers, even if there's a
Mm,
source of pain. So, that's called attachment to the perpetrator or a trauma bond. If it's someone who is maybe, narcissistic or unhealthy for us, or abusive, or all of the above,
yeah.
so, that can happen where we start seeking those kind of relationships or getting entangled in those kind of relationships as adults with narcissists for empaths, because, an empath can be an endless supply of compassion and forgiveness and kind of seeing the good in people.
Yeah.
And a narcissist is looking for someone to always idealize them, to,
Mm,
give them attention, to fulfill their needs. And
mm,
so it would naturally fit until, you know, um, an empath actually starts doing that healing work where they start actually providing the needs to their own inner child, that maybe that inner child is still looking
mm,
for that healing around, that caretaker, let's say it's a narcissist, validating them or giving them love. So rather than seeking that in relationships where it's likely not going to happen with, very toxic relationships, to be able to, as an empath, give that to yourself, to your own inner child. That's the work that I often do with clients.
yeah, that's amazing. I well, there were so many nuggets there.
Yeah.
I just absorbing it all in, and I was just thinking actually when you were saying everything that I think as well, empaths don't realize it's not just emotional abuse. It can
Hmm.
be physical abuse, it can be financial abuse,
Right.
and it can even also be sexual abuse.
Sure.
It's there are so many different layers to abuse when it comes to narcissists with empaths as well. That a lot of people take, and I've noticed it with like some of my clients as well, like with being empaths, they are like, it could be like financially abusive in the sense like their parents are like, oh no, don't worry about it, we'll be
Hmm.
fine. And that parent will always say that. But then if the child or the adult doesn't do what they say, then they're like, we're going to cut you off. And there's this
Right.
manipulation game. And I think a lot of empaths feel this because they are a family member or a friend or whoever it is or a partner, they feel like they can help them change, but the reality
Yes.
is they can't.
Yeah, yeah. And at the end of the day, it's all about allowing other people to have their own journey, and you really can't heal other people. They
Yeah.
have to do their own healing. And especially with, like, it's interesting with narcissists, there's that initial stage of love bombing
Mm,
where there's so much charm, there's so much attention. And I think it's easy for people to get sort of sucked into that. Obviously, there's a reason for that. And
yeah.
then the criticism and all the other things sort of come later. So it's, I think it's really important to look for red flags. Like if you're being charmed, to maybe be
Mm,
cautious around that, to wonder like why is someone charming you so much?
yeah.
And to not try to do someone else's work for them. You can't heal someone, you can't fix someone.
I almost believe, and this is just from my personal like experiences and with clients and people over the years, that if you try to fix or save somebody, you actually take on their karma. So actually, you're
Hmm.
absorbing more of their trauma, which then certain things happen in your life after. I've seen this happen before.
Hmm.
What's your thought on that? Just curious.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it gets so complicated because what's interesting about, like, I think empaths is they tend to internalize emotions. So they'll
Mm,
take on other people's shame, other people's, self-blame. They'll blame themselves for things
yeah.
that aren't theirs. Which, when you think about narcissists, it's literally the complete opposite. They're not internalizers, they're externalizers. So they blame everyone else. And so it's
Mm,
so easy for an empath, I think, to take on so many different things that really aren't theirs. And so, like, one strategy for that is to, if you're doing anything like what you're kind of describing, is sort of like energy work. And,
yeah.
what Dr. Judith Orloff talks a lot about, like protection and different strategies for empaths. And I think it's important to, at the end of the day, for an empath to sort of return that energy to the other person, to, if they picked up
Mm,
any energy throughout the day, to just like return that energy, to do some kind of like centering practice or meditation where you're imagining like all of that energy kind of leaving you, and that way you're not kind of stuck with it.
yeah. I get what you mean. Like any cord cutting. It's almost like
Yes,
cutting the cords of the other person's emotions that you've absorbed for the day.
absolutely.
Because that is so important. And I don't know if the same with yourself, but like I spend years taking on other people's trauma, and I had, like you said, the shame, the guilt of what the other person was thinking, but it wasn't even my stuff. But
Right.
because I hadn't had the tools to know what to do at that point in my life, I was then
Yeah.
thinking that's my story. And then I would
Mhm.
track relationships with those things happening. And I'd think, what's happened to me? I'm not like that. But it's because it was so stuck and knotted in my belly that I didn't know how to release it at that point.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I think the areas where we get especially stuck and the types of emotions that we especially, I think, pick up and sort of absorb from other people are the very ones that maybe we haven't worked on or healed.
Mm.
So let's say it's an anxiety,
Yeah.
you know, um, like I've worked on anxiety quite a bit, just any kind of anxiety that's, natural that we might experience. And so
Yeah.
when I'm with someone who's anxious, um, and of course it's different in my work, like I don't pick up emotions in my work because I have very clear boundaries there,
Yeah.
but like in your own life it's of course a little more tricky.
Yeah.
But in your personal life, so with anxiety, I'm going to be able to hold space very easily and not pick up on anxiety. But let's say it's anger or something like that,
Yeah.
I might be like, okay, well now I have to like actually like work with strategies here
Mm.
because anger might be a little bit tougher for me. And so I think it depends on which emotions you worked with. Like, let's say it's like grief or sadness, you might pick up more of that if you haven't worked through that on your own.
Oh,
So it
yeah.
really, I think those are the areas where we might notice we're more triggered.
Like, I'll give you an example. It's a little bit out there, a bit serious, but it's because it was a time in my life where I was a workaholic. I was working on my business. I had like my aha moment, and then a few years later, I was working on my business at that point, but not learning balance at that point. And I heard a loud thud from outside my balcony in my bedroom, and it turned out somebody had committed suicide, and I saw
Oh,
blood pouring from the sides, and I absorbed all that pain, but I didn't know
yeah.
I'd absorbed it. So I remember the next day feeling like I don't want to be in this world, and I
Hmm.
was like, that's not like me,
Yeah.
that's really weird. And
Yes.
so it took a, like, obviously years later now I was like, whoa, okay, that makes sense, now I know why that was happening. But at that point in my life where I hadn't known about empath energy or protection or healing, I suddenly started to feel like I was grieving, I was
Yeah.
sad. And I think a lot of empaths don't realize that, in the sense that whatever that person you're talking to or emotions, and if you've not protected yourself up at that point, you will then absorb it.
Yeah. That's, I mean, that's a really, I think, really vivid example
Yeah.
of what that process looks like, right? But I think it
Horrible.
happens so subtly all the time
Yeah.
too. But yeah, and I think, as a being trained as a therapist, way in the beginning, it was such an interesting process to notice, because you're trained to notice these things as a therapist, which is great, and why it's, easier to have so many tools at your disposal.
Yeah.
But to be trained to recognize, like, when you're starting to think a certain way or feel a certain way that you're not used to,
Mm.
um, you can ask yourself, like, is this mine?
Yeah.
And it's so helpful as a therapist to know how someone else feels, that it gives you great information. but you don't have to keep it, you know,
Mm.
or eventually you don't pick it up as much in terms of like absorbing it, but you do notice it. But I think it can be such a strange experience when you don't realize like what an empath is, when you don't recognize it. It can be really difficult because I think you can feel like you have all kinds of symptoms, like you have anxiety, you have depression, but really
Yeah.
maybe it's someone in your life who
Yeah.
has that anxiety or depression. Um,
Or like, I don't know about if you've noticed, but like some empaths are like, I've tried everything, like before they come to us. I've tried everything. I've tried meditation, I've tried yoga, but
mhm.
nothing. And then you're like, well, have you created boundaries? Have you done this? And they're like, what?
Yes.
Energy cutting? What? And it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, not all the normal tools that everyone uses actually helps empaths. We actually need separate tools to help us to really ground ourselves and really understand ourselves.
Absolutely, absolutely. Like for someone who has maybe less of a like a fawn trauma response and more of like, let's say, a fight response, fight
Yeah.
trauma response, where they're angry and irritable and things like that. For them, like when they're like very reactive, like emotion regulation tools that help you to calm down all the time, those are great to have to work on that. But
Yeah.
for someone who's an empath and has like that fawn trauma response where it's all about helping other people, um, the healing work isn't so much about like emotion regulation. I mean, maybe centering yourself, sure, and working with your nervous system in self-care kind of ways, but it's not about being more calm. It's not about being more emotionally regulated all the time. It's not about like numbing yourself to feelings.
Yeah.
You know, it's more about that empowerment work that you're talking about so that people don't feel like a victim, so
Mm.
that they feel like, they actually can set healthy boundaries. They can work on their self-care. So really the work is about turning your attention away from other people. You don't have to tune into everyone's suffering all the time. And it's not your job to help everyone, but
Yeah.
rather to turn all that energy to doing that internal work where you're actually directing a lot of that loving energy toward your inner child, because that's what's getting triggered, you
Yeah.
know. That's the part of us that's looking for the safety and the protection and the nurturing.
Mm. And what's fascinating as well is that, when you first say that to somebody, to an empath, oh, you need to do the inner work, or you need to heal, they're like, or you need to love yourself. They're like, oh, no, no, but I need to help everybody else. They almost feel like they have no right to work on themselves. It's
Yeah.
they feel guilty or ashamed because somebody told them to, like, somebody may in their life might have called them selfish, but really they're not the selfish ones. It's the other people that who are saying that are being
Yes.
selfish.
Oh, the people who are benefiting from their lack of selfishness, for sure would discourage kind of anything as and consider it like selfish. But like I think that's the part of the work is healing that wound of unworthiness,
Yeah.
because people who are more self-absorbed or narcissistic or abusive, not to say that narcissists aren't abusive, but
Yeah.
um, there's a spectrum, and you know they will make an empath feel like they're never going to be good enough.
Mm.
They're never going to be, enough for that narcissist. And that has nothing to do with actual inherent worth, which is always there,
Yeah.
but rather, the empath trying to prove their worthiness.
Mm.
And really, like one of the things that I often see with clients is that they will make it their life's mission to try to prove their worthiness to a
Yeah.
narcissist. And they might pick like one narcissist, and it's not necessarily like a romantic relationship. It
Yeah.
could be like a friendship, or a frenemy. It could be like their nemesis. It could be a boss, but it's proving their worth or parent, it could be
Mm.
anyone. Um, Proving their worth to someone becomes sort of or maybe like an insecure attachment where they, in a romantic relationship, they want that person to want them back in the same way. And maybe that's just not happening. And so
Mm.
one of the things I think is so important for empaths is for them to actually, and I'll have clients do this, list all the people in your life who do support you,
Mm.
who do see actually, your sensitivity as beautiful, who accept you just as you are. And, invariably, like when I have clients do that, there's a decent sized list there, but they're, they tend to be focused because, you know, there needs to be some healing work around the
Yeah.
original relationships, but they tend to focus on that one narcissist rather than this long list of supportive people who are there
Yeah.
for them
Yeah.
and accept them.
Or how they've treated them. They don't. They're doing everything they can, but they're still not getting the love back.
Exactly.
Yeah. I hear you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it'll never be enough. So, it's important to just turn away from that. And, that's not a process. That's not easy. It's a process,
Mm.
but turning that attention toward themselves. And, one of the things is really important is just to recognize what a narcissist is, or what an unhealthy relationship is, what is, toxic behavior. And just because you can regulate that person's emotions so that they are nicer to you occasionally, um, that doesn't mean that you're really changing their behavior. It means you're calming them down for about 5 minutes, And so that's not a solution or a long-term solution.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to ask you actually, how how do you help empaths like to become aware of their trauma? So I know you're saying about narcissists, but how else do you help them to become aware?
Usually, people will come in because they recognize that either there's anxiety, often, or they'll recognize that their relationships maybe aren't as healthy as they could be. Often it's because they recognize that they have a boundary issue. I think people are a little bit more aware of these type of things. I think because partially it's, you see it on social media now, so
Yeah.
there is more education, which I think is so great. That people are a little bit more aware that like they need to work on something, but they don't know how.
Hmm.
So, but if that's not the case, maybe they're just coming in for like symptoms of anxiety, or maybe they are kind of aware of some trauma that's getting re-triggered. Um, then it's sort of, I think it depends on the situation, but even if it's, let's say it's anxiety, for example, we might notice that what that really means is that there's and like the way that I work is it's called internal family systems therapy, which is basically like you see different parts of yourself rather than like, just one personality.
Hmm.
We have different facets of our personality that are natural. And so we might look at like an inner child as a younger part of us that's wounded.
Yeah.
And so with anxiety, it might be that that younger part doesn't feel safe and is asking to be healed, and it's trying to get your attention. And so we would kind of, work our way, sort of down and maybe work with like the protective parts of our personality first, and then eventually get to that inner child healing work where we look at like, the lack of safety, or what does this part need, and to do some healing work around giving that part a new experience so that you can actually heal the memory, or like the original trauma memory, and have that part be empowered and more present, and so that you can be embodied. Like when we heal these parts, um, we actually, are sort of taking an old memory,
Hmm.
and we're sort of opening it up, working with it to make it, healed. To sort of and there's all kinds of technical ways to explain that, but
Yeah.
essentially it's, we're bringing that part into the present and unburdening the wound that it has, so that the wound can sort of be released, the emotions that were stuck can be released, and then we feel more embodied when we do that type of work because we're no longer stuck in
Hmm.
the past.
And also, I guess it's with like letting go of the stagnant energy they've had about that
Mm-hmm.
situation for decades that's just somehow stored in the body as well. Whereas
Yes.
when you like actually like picking it, you're like peeling it slowly, but you're peeling back the layers. You actually then actually help your nervous system to like feel relaxed as well, and that anxiety or depression suddenly just starts to slowly go away.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is like a slow process of, working with those parts of us. But yeah, it helps the nervous system because, trauma is in the body. So releasing those stuck emotions, which are kind of represented as these younger parts of ourselves that were wounded, really it frees us up so much. And I think that's a part of the work of becoming an empowered empath, so that it's less about, sort of identifying with like a victim role, or trying to seek things from people, whether it's
Mm.
validation or helping them enough so that they're better, um, and more about you already feel, content. You already feel
Yeah.
like all of those, you feel embodied, you feel more present. So there's less of a need to actually do something for other people, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. God, there's so many more things I could ask you.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Being an empath, like there's so many layers to us that we didn't really know growing up. And it's only as we start to have that awareness and we understand ourselves that a lot of the things that we grew up with were actually holding us back from really being in our empowered energy.
Yeah, yeah, I think that that's really the key is I think like we were saying, like a lot of empaths try to shut things down.
Yeah.
I think there's a fantasy that like if I weren't an empath, then I could be, doing this or doing that, or if I weren't an empath, this is what my life would look like. But really, when we start to embrace the, sort of, I guess you can call it the gift. It doesn't always feel like a gift,
Yeah.
but the gift of being an empath, and really just celebrate those things and, are unapologetic about them.
Hmm.
I think that's really the key. Then it can just, it makes your life so much richer. And like, people really appreciate, I think, the insight of an empath and the ability to hold space for others, the rich internal world that an empath can have. I think people do appreciate those things, especially once we appreciate them.
Yeah. I was just going to say, when you're saying people, some people are like, oh, I wish I wasn't an empath. I get loads of messages saying, oh, being an empath is a curse. And I'm like, no,
Right.
it's a gift. What are you talking about? It's just that you're just stuck right now and you're not
Yeah.
knowing how to heal the past and then use your tools to help you grow. You just haven't learned those things that we really should have learned at a young age, to be honest. But unfortunately, our world, as you know, is very masculated.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's some balance
Yeah.
coming, but we grew up
Yeah.
with very masculine, like an energy in the world, didn't we? If you think about it, looking back at our childhoods, it was very masculated, the whole power shoulder pads, even women trying to be like men. So obviously,
Yes.
naturally, the empaths would shut down their emotions in order to try and fit into a society. But really, it was never about fitting into society, because I've always believed like there's a reason why we were born sensitive. There's a reason why we were born to be empaths, because the divine wanted us, or higher power, whatever you want to call it, created us this way. And us ignoring it is basically doing a disservice.
Right. Absolutely. And I think it's really great too when empaths start to embrace that and to recognize that like the feminine is so important, and also just balancing the feminine and masculine, and rather than like a toxic masculine kind of energy, it's more of a healthy balanced kind of energy. I think it's so empowering too when you see empaths like turning their empath skills into like maybe a business, being an entrepreneur,
Mm,
or ways to serve others that feels like service
yeah,
rather than servitude. In
yeah,
other words, it's like what they want to do. It's what they choose to do. It's what they enjoy, rather than feeling like martyred, like, oh, I have to save the world or I have to do something. Like, no, you don't have to do anything, actually. Um, but if you enjoy this, like, here's a way to do it where you are helping people, but it comes from like a different place.
yeah. And I think a lot of empaths now, like you said, like they're seeing things on social media, they're becoming aware that this kind of 9 to 5 life doesn't fit them, because it's based on old kind of masculine energy. So
Yeah.
they're trying to find a way to, like you said, to embrace the feminine side. And that is through creating a business or doing something that nurtures their soul instead of drains them.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I could ever have that kind of a lifestyle. Like, I need like
Yeah.
total freedom for like scheduling my being flexible. Like, I
Yeah.
think a lot of people are really turning to entrepreneurship for that reason, where they kind of want more freedom. And, to as an entrepreneur, you can, as an empath. Now, of course, like not everybody has that luxury of being an
Yeah.
entrepreneur, or interest even. But if there's some way that you can work having breaks that are healthy, I think,
Yeah.
into your schedule as an empath, that's so important. To take that break, to like take a walk, to get out of the office,
Mm.
to go into nature when you can, to, take a little meditation break, maybe to just, or to be with animals,
Mm.
whatever it might be for you. I think it's so important to find ways to have that balanced energy, even if you're in an environment where it feels like it's very kind of like that, what you described as that's very like hustle and like 9 to 5, it has to, or more than 9 to 5, like a lot of hours. And it's just, you're working in ways that maybe aren't supportive of your empath, you know, traits. I think it's important to try to build in some of that alone time, maybe, or some of those like um, more self-care practices, when possible.
Yeah, there needs to be more like play versus work. I think too much empaths are trying to prove themselves so much through working hard. If I work harder, my boss will notice me, or if I work harder, I'll be super successful. But really, it's about balance, like you said. But I guess when you're not aware of your energy as an empath, you end up tipping yourself into the overwork mode instead of actually realizing all you need is like you said, some relaxation, some meditation, or grounding yourself in nature. Hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I learned a lot from like Judith Orloff's work, is just like a light touch, a light, little bit goes a long way. We don't have to work so hard. We don't have to try to prove our worthiness.
Yeah.
I think that, or try to overhelp people, but
Hmm.
like a light touch goes a long way. And
Yeah.
so it's a lot about balancing that kind of flow, like harnessing more of that flow energy. Like that's really important to me, to try to be more in the flow. And so I know that forcing things never, ever, ever, ever works for me. Absolutely
Yeah.
not. So I try to be in the flow as much as possible. Some things that work for other people won't work for you.
Yeah.
And so it's important to recognize what works for you, and to try to, stay in that flow, and have like healthy practices that feel kind of like in alignment with who you are.
Wow, we're coming towards the end of the show. I've just noticed the time.
Yeah.
Oh wow. I've got a few more questions left for you. Oh wow.
Yeah.
And what are your 5 top tips for empaths who they want to take their power back, but they don't really know where to start?
Yeah, I think the first step is recognizing that fawn trauma response, which is like almost like, you could feel it in your nervous system. You could feel it in your body, where you want to jump in. You want to people please. You want to take away someone's suffering. Um, and in those situations, it's important to notice when that happens, to notice like, how does that look in my body? How does that feel? And to, um, you know, literally walk away in those situations, rather than jumping in, over helping, maybe either pausing or walking away, or self-soothing and just doing less, so that you let people have their feelings. You let people be uncomfortable. You don't have to take that away from them. Actually, to recognize that feelings, uncomfortable feelings, are a normal part of life. And I think that the second thing would be to just recognize, um, you know, and get comfortable with uncomfortable feelings, or painful feelings, even though it is difficult to, and some ways to do that are to work with like mindfulness-based kind of approaches. There are a lot of different therapies that are, you can do on your own or with a therapist, that are mindfulness-based, that can help you to get comfortable with discomfort, whether it's like uncomfortable emotions or sensations. So some of those are called acceptance and commitment therapy, or dialectical behavior therapy. Different like mindfulness approaches can help us tolerate discomfort. I would say the third thing is to learn to spot narcissists, and spot them early if possible, and to stop feeding them and idealizing them as though maybe they've got the answer, maybe they know what they're doing because they're so convincing, right? And to, find some healthy boundaries with them, like if you're stuck with them, like if they're your boss or something like that, or to steer clear of them, or to just learn how to manage them so that their impact on your life is less, if you're stuck kind of in a situation. I would say the fourth thing is to engage in reparenting. So that inner child work that we're talking about, to work with those parts of us that are wounded, and to show them that we're here for them, that we're going to protect them, and we're going to nurture them. And part of that protection is to protect them from, toxic, harmful people. Um, without totally villainizing everyone. Like, not everyone is toxic, not everyone is harmful, but the people who are, to be able to protect yourself from that, and to be able to be a source of your own attachment. so that you have a relationship with your inner child parts, rather than, relying on your relationship with maybe unhealthy people as a source of your, attachment and security. And then the last thing I would say is, going back to like the main idea, which is focusing on yourself. You don't have to tune into everyone's emotions. You don't have to save the world. It's, if you are doing it for work, it's more about service than servitude. And to just take all that energy that you put out there in the world and bring it back to yourself. And that isn't selfish. That's actually, the necessary step, because when you're always trying to help other people and fix other people and things like that, or emotionally regulate other people, it actually doesn't do them any good, in the sense that sometimes you're even causing more problems than you're helping in that situation. Yeah. And so really it's about focusing back on yourself and letting them have their own journey.
They were amazing, and I 100% agree with you on that especially last one, that it's about putting yourself first. And I think you've been empaths have been conditioned for so long to think that they need to give, but it's time for you to receive. It's time for you to feel perfect, loving and complete and nourished. It's time for you to accept yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And with someone else who maybe doesn't have a lot of empathy, the work would be completely different. It would be to teach them empathy skills and help them learn how to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And to be okay with that. So that would be a different work for someone else. But for someone who's an empath, it's about feeling strength in your vulnerability, which is very different.
Yeah, 100%. Wow. And what are you most grateful for?
I think, with the pandemic, something new I think that has happened is that I've just been spending so much more time outdoors. And even when it's cold, which I used to, as a sensory thing, I'd be like, oh, I can't take the cold. But now I've been spending so much time in nature, like going for walks in nature. Even when it's like cold, I've actually learned to really enjoy it. Even when it's super, super cold, it just means warmer clothes, really. But so it's time in nature and outdoors. I'd say that's something I'm really grateful for.
Bless. And what shines your inner light?
Oh, what shines my inner light? I think just being very connected to that, deepest and highest, most authentic part of myself without spiritually bypassing emotions. But integrating the two, that is what feels most aligning. And, that feels like it's my highest inner light and things like that. So that feels really good. Yeah.
Bless you. Well, thank you, Anna, for being on the show. This was very powerful. I feel like we
so
both
much for having me.
Bless you. I was going to say, we felt like we both were just like expanding and growing and sharing together. It was beautiful. And I really appreciate everything that you're doing for empaths, because we do need more empath leaders out there to help us to really nourish in this unbalanced world.
Yeah. Well, this was so much fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, bless you. Oh, what an amazing conversation with Anna today. It's so amazing when you meet other empaths who have gone through the dark night of the soul and really have discovered their inner light and their power. And I'm just so grateful that we were able to share everything today, and just share the knowledge that we both have, that we grew up as empaths and we were born as empaths. However, we learned to take our power back and learned that there was actually nothing wrong with us. There was so much right about us. Unfortunately, that's the end of the show. For more information about Anna, do check out the show notes at www.gerdshundel.com. And before I leave, I want to leave you with this quote. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you'll find strength. That's a quote by Marcus Aurelius. Take care. And remember, stay happy, stay healthy, stay lit.